Tonight, we journey back to a fortress carved into silence. High above the world, where cold mountain winds whisper through stone corridors and torches flicker against ancient walls, a secret order waits in the darkness. For over a century and a half, this place has been untouchable. For over a century and a half, kings have slept in armor because of the shadows that moved through their courts. But on this night in the year 1256, something approaches from the east. Something that does not fear shadows, something that does not negotiate with fear, something that will change everything. Imagine this for a moment. Imagine a world where the most powerful rulers of their age wore chainmail beneath their royal robes, not for ceremony but for survival. Imagine a world where a beggar approaching your tent might be a perfectly trained operative who has waited years, perhaps decades, for this single moment. Imagine a world where death didn't come from armies marching over horizons, but from a dagger held by someone you trusted, someone who smiled as they struck, someone who never tried to escape because escape was never the point. This is not fantasy. This is not the stuff of video games or modern fiction, though if you've ever heard of certain legendary tales about hidden blades and ancient orders, you're already touching the edges of this true story. This is history. And tonight, we're going to explore what happened when the most feared covert organization the medieval world had ever known came face to face with an empire that had perfected the art of total annihilation. The question that haunts this entire story, the question we'll carry with us through these next hours together, is this: did the assassins dig their own grave with the very tactics they perfected? Or was their destruction simply inevitable when a small power, no matter how sophisticated, confronted the world's mightiest empire? Or perhaps, just perhaps, this is actually a story about a world that transformed while they stood still, believing their ancient methods would work forever. Let the cold night air settle around you. Let the distant sound of wind across mountain peaks fill your mind. We're going back now, back to the 11th century, back to a world fracturing along religious lines, back to the moment when one brilliant, desperate man decided that if he couldn't build an army, he would build something far more terrifying. A network of believers willing to die for a cause, willing to wait in plain sight for years, willing to strike at the very heart of power itself. The year is 1050, and the Islamic world is tearing itself apart. What was once a unified empire stretching from the shores of Spain to the borders of India has shattered into competing kingdoms, each claiming legitimacy, each claiming divine right, each willing to spill blood to prove their claim. But this isn't just political rivalry. This is something far deeper, far more personal, far more dangerous. This is a religious fracture that began at the very moment the Prophet Muhammad died, a fracture that asks the most fundamental question any community of faith can ask: who has the right to lead us toward God? The Sunni majority believed leadership should be earned through merit, through capability, through the consensus of the community's wisest voices. The Shia minority believed differently. For them, leadership could only flow through blood, through the Prophet's direct descendants, through his daughter Fatima and his son-in-law Ali. This wasn't simply a political disagreement that could be negotiated away over trade agreements or territorial borders. This was a theological divide that cut to the very core of what people believed about divine will, about legitimate authority, about the nature of truth itself. And within the Shia community, another fracture had formed. In the year 765, when the sixth Imam died, his followers split over which son should succeed him. The majority followed the younger son and became known as the 12 or Shia. But a minority followed the elder son, Ismail, and from this choice emerged something remarkable, something mystical, something that would eventually give birth to our story. They called themselves Ismailis, and they developed a complex system of thought that merged Greek philosophy with Islamic theology, that embraced hidden meanings beneath surface texts, that believed in levels of understanding most people never reached. By the 10th century, these Ismailis had achieved something extraordinary. They established the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, ruling from the magnificent city of Cairo. They built universities that attracted scholars from across the known world. They created centers of learning where mathematics and astronomy flourished. They proved that a minority sect could not only survive but thrive, could not only exist but excel. Al-Azhar University, founded in 970, became one of the intellectual jewels of the medieval world. The House of Wisdom stood as a testament to the power of knowledge over brute force. But success in Egypt could not protect Ismailis everywhere. Across Persia, across Iraq, across the vast territories controlled by the Sunni Seljuk Empire, life for Shia believers was increasingly dangerous. The Seljuks were Turkic warriors who had swept down from Central Asia, conquered the old Persian heartlands, and by 1055 had entered Baghdad itself. The Abbasid Caliph, the nominal leader of Sunni Islam, granted them the title of Sultan. From that moment, the Seljuks became the dominant military power across the Middle East, and for religious minorities, especially Ismailis who were considered not just heretics but dangerous heretics, the pressure became unbearable. Ismailis in Seljuk territories faced systematic persecution. They were taxed more heavily than other communities. They were barred from positions of influence. Their mosques were destroyed. Their scholars were imprisoned or worse. Many practiced taqiyya, the art of concealment, hiding their true beliefs to survive. They prayed in secret. They taught their children in whispers. They lived double lives, presenting Sunni faces to the world while maintaining Ismaili faith in the privacy of their homes. But concealment is exhausting. Concealment is humiliating. And for some, concealment was not enough. Some began to dream of something different, something bolder, something that would allow them not merely to survive but to strike back. And this was the mistake that would eventually destroy them. Or was it? We'll discover the answer together. Hassan-i Sabbah was born in 1050 in the city of Qom, deep in the heart of Persia. His father was a scholar, a man of books and learning, a man who understood that in a world of swords, sometimes the pen was not mightier, but it was certainly more subtle. From his earliest childhood, Hassan was immersed in learning. He memorized the Quran. He studied the traditions of the Prophet. He excelled in mathematics and astronomy, subjects that required patience, precision, and the ability. The legend says these three friends made a pact. Whoever achieved success first would help the others. It's a beautiful story, and almost certainly false since the dates don't align properly. But like many legends, it contains a deeper truth. Hassan moved in circles of power and learning. He understood how systems worked. He understood how individuals rose and fell. He understood, perhaps better than anyone of his generation, that power in the medieval Islamic world flowed through networks of personal loyalty, through webs of obligation, through the careful manipulation of fear and favor. When Hassan was a teenager, his family moved to Ray, a vibrant city near what would one day become Tehran. Here, the young scholar encountered something that would change his life forever. He met an Ismaili missionary, a man named Abdul Malik ibn Atash, who was conducting quiet, careful work converting people to the Ismaili interpretation of Islam. These conversations planted seeds in Hassan's mind. They offered answers to questions he hadn't known he was asking. They promised a level of understanding beyond the surface meanings of texts, a direct connection to divine truth through the Imam, who was not merely a political leader but God's representative on earth. Then Hassan fell ill. Not just sick but desperately, terrifyingly ill. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, and he truly believed he was dying. In his fever, lying in darkness, feeling his strength drain away, he was seized by a profound fear. What if he died without knowing the truth? What if he died having never fully understood his purpose? What if death came before enlightenment? He recovered. And when he did, he was transformed. He formally converted to Ismailism and threw himself into the cause with the intensity of someone who has looked into the abyss and returned. He became a missionary himself, a dai, traveling and teaching and converting. But Hassan was different from other missionaries. Hassan had vision. Hassan had strategic imagination. Hassan understood something that others didn't. In a world where Ismailis couldn't raise armies, where they couldn't challenge the Seljuks in open battle, where conventional power was impossible, unconventional power might be the only option. In 1078, Hassan made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would journey to Egypt, to Cairo, to the heart of Fatimid power, to meet the Imam himself. The journey took months. He traveled through Azerbaijan, through Mosul, through Damascus. He debated with Sunni scholars in cities where such debates could get you killed. He gathered intelligence about political situations, about weaknesses in Seljuk control, about opportunities that might exist for someone clever enough to exploit them. He was building a map in his mind, not just a geographical map, but a political map, a map of power structures and vulnerabilities. When Hassan finally reached Cairo, he was received with honor by Imam al-Mustansir, the Fatimid Caliph. According to some sources, the Imam told Hassan something in private, something significant. His eldest son Nizar would be the next Imam. Remember this detail. It will matter later when everything falls apart. Hassan spent about 18 months in Cairo studying at the House of Wisdom, learning the sophisticated organizational techniques the Fatimids had developed, understanding how to run covert operations across vast distances, how to maintain networks of believers in hostile territories, how to coordinate action without central control. He was learning tradecraft, though that word wouldn't be invented for centuries. But Hassan also made a powerful enemy. The Fatimid vizier, Badr al-Jamali, took a dislike to this intense Persian scholar. Perhaps Hassan was too outspoken. Perhaps Hassan supported Nizar too publicly while the vizier had other plans. Perhaps Hassan simply reminded the vizier of threats to his own power. Whatever the reason, Hassan was forced to leave Egypt earlier than he'd planned. The journey home nearly killed him. Hassan's ship encountered a massive storm in the Mediterranean. The sailors panicked, certain they would sink, certain death was moments away. But Hassan remained calm. According to legend, he told the terrified crew, "My master, the Imam, has promised that I will return to Persia safely. This storm cannot harm me." And strangely, impossibly, the storm subsided. The ship survived. Whether this story is true or embellished doesn't matter. What matters is that Hassan returned to Persia in 1081 with something more valuable than any treasure. He returned with a plan. He understood now what needed to be done. Ismailis couldn't win through conventional warfare. They couldn't match the Seljuk soldier for soldier. But they didn't need to. They needed something else. They needed a fortress. They needed a symbol. They needed a place so defensible, so unreachable, that it could never be taken by force. And from that place they could project power in an entirely new way. For the next 7 years, Hassan traveled through Persia, preaching, converting, organizing. But he was also searching. He was looking for the perfect location, the perfect fortress, the perfect defensive position from which to begin building something the world had never quite seen before. In 1088, Hassan found what he was looking for. High in the Alborz mountain range, about 100 kilometers northwest of modern Tehran, perched on a narrow rock outcrop over 2,000 meters above sea level, stood a fortress called Alamut. The name itself carries poetry. Some say it means eagle's nest, because legend tells of an ancient king who saw an eagle land on this rocky peak and took it as a divine sign. Others say it derives from words in the local language meaning, the eagle's teaching. Whatever its etymology, the name proved prophetic. This would become the nest from which Hassan's eagles would fly, striking at targets across the Islamic world. Alamut was not merely defensible. It was nearly impossible to assault. The fortress sat on a narrow ridge of rock, accessible only by a single winding path that climbed through treacherous terrain. On either side, cliffs dropped hundreds of meters into valleys below. Militarily, attacking Alamut would be a nightmare. Any army trying to storm it would have to funnel through choke points where defenders could rain arrows and stones down on attackers who had nowhere to hide, no way to maneuver, no tactical options beyond simply climbing directly into death. But Hassan saw more than military advantage. He saw the valley below, the Rudbar Valley, populated mostly by poor Shia farmers who resented their Sunni overlords, who paid heavy taxes to distant masters, who had no particular loyalty to the Seljuk system. His supporters inside the fortress, perhaps only a few dozen men, moved simultaneously. They seized control of key gates. They secured the armory. They isolated the fortress commander, a man named Mahdi. By the time Mahdi understood what was happening, it was already over. He was surrounded by men he'd thought were loyal, men who now answered to someone else. Hassan didn't kill Mahdi. Violence was a tool, not a principle, and here violence wasn't necessary. Hassan offered Mahdi a deal: leave peacefully and receive 3,000 gold dinars as compensation for his loss. Mahdi looked at the faces around him, looked at how many of his own guards had turned, looked at the situation with the cold assessment of a professional soldier who knows when he's been outmaneuvered. He accepted. He left. He took his gold and disappeared from history. Not a single arrow was fired. Not a single drop of blood was spilled. Alamut now belonged to Hassan-i Sabbah, and he had taken it through infiltration, through patience, through understanding that fortresses are held not by walls but by the men who stand on those walls. For Hassan Sabbah, Alamut wasn't just a fortress. It was a dream carved into stone. It was proof that cleverness could defeat strength, that a small group of dedicated believers could stand against empires, that the world's power structures were more fragile than they appeared. Within weeks, Hassan transformed his new home. He reinforced the walls, making strong things stronger. He deepened the water cisterns, knowing that sieges would come. He stockpiled food enough to last for years. He improved the irrigation systems in the valley below, ensuring the community could feed itself indefinitely. He established a library, collecting manuscripts from across the Islamic world, understanding that knowledge was a weapon as sharp as any blade. And he waited. He waited because he knew the Seljuks would respond. He knew armies would come. He knew his tiny fortress, his eagle's nest, would soon face the full fury of the most powerful empire in the Middle East. The response came quickly. Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuk vizier, the most powerful man in the empire, ordered the governor of Ray to destroy this upstart fortress and its heretical occupants. Seljuk forces marched into the Alborz Mountains. They surrounded Alamut. They attempted to storm the narrow paths. They tried to starve the fortress into submission. And they failed. The fortress was too high. The paths too narrow. The defenders too determined. After months of siege, after losing men to ambushes in the valleys, after exhausting their supplies while the people inside Alamut seemed perfectly comfortable, the Seljuk forces withdrew. It was humiliating. It was instructive. It told Hassan everything he needed to know. Alamut could not be taken by conventional means. But Hassan didn't stop with one fortress. He began a systematic campaign to capture more. Sometimes he used the same technique that had worked at Alamut, sending missionaries to convert the local population, then using those converts to seize control from within. Sometimes he used surprise attacks, striking at fortresses in the night when guards were drowsy and unprepared. Slowly, methodically, a network of Nizari fortresses spread across Persia. They weren't contiguous territory. They couldn't be. They were islands, isolated points of control scattered through a sea of Seljuk power. But fortresses were defensive. Fortresses were reactive. Hassan understood that to truly challenge the Seljuks, to truly protect his growing community, he needed something offensive. He needed a weapon that could reach into the heart of enemy power, that could strike at decision-makers themselves, that could make the powerful live in fear. He needed assassins. And what the assassins didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly understand yet as they perfected their terrible art, was that the world had already changed. The rules they were mastering would not be the rules forever. But for now, for the next century and a half, they would become the most feared covert operatives the medieval world had ever known. Let me tell you about the Fedai. Let me tell you about what made these men different from every other warrior, every other soldier, every other killer in the medieval world. Because understanding them is understanding the entire system Hassan built, the entire philosophy that would terrorize the Islamic world for generations. The word Fedai comes from Arabic roots meaning one who sacrifices, or one who is devoted. These weren't mercenaries fighting for pay. They weren't conscripts forced into service. They were volunteers, true believers who saw their mission as sacred duty, who believed that by following the Imam's commands transmitted through Hassan, they were fulfilling God's will on earth. Hassan sought specific qualities when selecting potential Fedai. He wanted young men, yes, but not just any young men. He wanted intelligence. He wanted adaptability. He wanted people who could think, who could blend, who could wait. Physical strength mattered less than mental discipline. Skill with weapons mattered less than skill with patience. The training was extraordinary. A Fedai didn't just learn how to kill. He learned languages. If his mission might take him to Turkish territories, he learned Turkish. If he might operate in Arab lands, he perfected Arabic. If he might need to infiltrate Crusader kingdoms, he learned Latin or French. He studied religion, not just Ismaili theology but Sunni doctrine, Christian practices, whatever belief system he might need to convincingly fake. A Fedai learned to be anyone. He could play a merchant, trading goods in marketplaces while watching his target's movements. He could play a cleric, offering prayers and blessings while mapping out security arrangements. He could play a soldier, joining a ruler's guard force and waiting, sometimes for years, until the moment came to strike. And this is what made them psychological weapons rather than merely physical ones. The waiting. A typical assassination wasn't a quick operation. It could take years to prepare. A Fedai would be sent to a city. He would establish a new identity. He would build a life. He would marry, have children, become part of the community. His cover wasn't a disguise he put on in the morning and took off at night. It was his entire existence. He lived the role completely until the distinction between cover and reality blurred. Then, when he was trusted, when he had access, when the perfect moment arrived, he would strike. The weapon was always a dagger. Always close. Always personal. Never poison, never arrows, never anything that might fail or miss. The Fedai approached his target in public, in spaces filled with witnesses, in mosques. It suggested that these men had transcended normal human fears, that they operated according to logic outsiders couldn't comprehend. There's a famous legend, probably exaggerated but revealing nonetheless, about a meeting between the Syrian branch of the assassins and King Amalric I of Jerusalem. The Crusader king wanted to ally with the assassins against other Muslim states. He sent envoys to the fortress of Masyaf to negotiate. When the envoys arrived, they witnessed something they never forgot. At a signal from the assassin leader, several Fedai threw themselves off the fortress walls, plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. No hesitation. No fear. Just immediate obedience unto death. Whether this actually happened doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it could happen. What matters is the psychological impact such stories created. Rulers across the Islamic world began living in constant fear. They wore armor under their clothes. They slept with guards surrounding their beds. They trusted no one. They screened every visitor. They tasted all food before eating it. And still they didn't feel safe because the assassins had proven that no amount of security could guarantee protection. The first major political assassination ordered by Hassan occurred in 1092. The target was none other than Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuk vizier, the most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan himself. Nizam had ordered the persecution of Ismailis across Seljuk territories. He had commanded massacres of Ismaili communities. He had made the destruction of Hassan's movement his personal mission. One evening in October 1092, Nizam al-Mulk was traveling by litter from Isfahan to Baghdad. A man dressed as a Sufi mystic, the kind of wandering holy man common on medieval roads, approached the litter. The guards didn't stop him. Sufi mystics were considered harmless, even blessed. They were so far removed from worldly violence that threatening them was considered sacrilege. The disguised Fedai got close to the litter. In one smooth motion, he drew a dagger and thrust it through the curtain, piercing Nizam al-Mulk's heart. The vizier died almost instantly. The assassin made no attempt to flee. He stood calmly as guards cut him down, his mission complete, his death meaningless compared to what he'd accomplished. Nizam al-Mulk's death sent shockwaves through the Seljuk Empire. Within weeks, Sultan Malik Shah also died, possibly poisoned, though history remains unclear about who was responsible. Suddenly the empire plunged into civil war. Princes fought each other for succession. Provinces broke away. In this chaos, Hassan's fortresses didn't just survive, they expanded. This assassination established a pattern that would continue for over a century. The targets were always powerful. Sultans, viziers, generals, caliphs, occasionally even crusader leaders. Never civilians. Never random attacks meant to create indiscriminate terror. Every assassination had a clear political purpose, a specific strategic goal. This wasn't terrorism in the modern sense. This was precision political violence, surgical strikes against command structures. In 1121, the assassins executed one of their boldest operations. The target was Al-Afdal Shahanshah, the vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Alafdhal had betrayed the Nizari cause by deposing Nizar, the rightful heir, and placing his younger brother on the throne instead. For Hassan and his followers, Alafdhal represented the ultimate betrayal, a man who had perverted the proper succession and split the Ismaili community. 3 Fedai were sent to Cairo. They disguised themselves as merchants and lived in the city for months, mapping Alafdhal's routines, identifying vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment. One day, as Alafdhal walked through Cairo's streets, the 3 Fedai approached from different directions simultaneously. They attacked together, their daggers striking in coordinated precision. Alafdhal died on the spot, stabbed multiple times. 2 of the assassins were killed immediately by guards. The third tried to escape but was captured and executed. Alafdhal's death created a political earthquake in Cairo. Interestingly, the Fatimid court celebrated. They held 7 days of festivities, not to mourn but to rejoice at the departure of a despotic vizier who had oppressed even his own caliph. But the celebration was tinged with terror. If assassins could kill the most powerful man in Egypt, right in the heavily guarded capital, then no one was truly safe. In 1192, the Syrian assassins executed an operation that impacted the Crusades themselves. The target was Conrad of Montferrat, newly elected king of Jerusalem but not yet crowned. Conrad had offended the Syrian assassins by seizing a ship carrying their trade goods and executing the sailors. It was a relatively minor provocation, but Hassan's organization didn't forgive slights, and they didn't forget. 2 Fedai disguised themselves as Christian monks and lived in Tyre, where Conrad resided, for several months. They learned Latin. They participated in Christian religious services. They became familiar, trusted presences in the community. One day when Conrad was walking through the streets with minimal security, a rare lapse, the 2 Fedai struck. One stabbed Conrad while the other blocked anyone from interfering. Conrad was mortally wounded and died days later. This assassination had unexpected consequences. Richard the Lionheart, King of England, who was leading the Third Crusade, became suspected of hiring the assassins to eliminate Conrad due to political disputes between them. There was no real evidence for this accusation, but the rumor persisted for centuries, damaging Richard's reputation. This demonstrates something crucial. Even being suspected of association with the assassins could destroy a ruler's political standing. The organization's reputation for effectiveness was so great that powerful people genuinely feared being blamed for using them. Perhaps the most famous target the assassins failed to kill was Saladin, the legendary Kurdish general who defeated the Crusaders and recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. The Syrian assassins attempted to assassinate Saladin at least twice. The first time was in 1175 when Saladin was besieging the assassin fortress at Masyaf. Several Fedai infiltrated his tent but were discovered and killed by guards before completing their mission. The second attempt came in 1176. A group of Fedai disguised themselves as soldiers in Saladin's own army. They waited for days, perhaps weeks, blending in, marching alongside men they intended to betray. One night, they attacked Saladin's tent. Saladin survived, and Saladin would not attack their fortresses. It was a pragmatic arrangement that benefited both parties, but it was born from Saladin's genuine fear of an enemy he couldn't defeat through conventional military means. The Mongols did not fight wars. They ended civilizations. And they were coming. But the assassins, masters of shadow warfare, didn't yet understand what that meant. They didn't understand that the world's rules were about to change. They had perfected a strategy for a specific kind of world, a world of fragmented power, of individual rulers who mattered, of states that operated according to certain unspoken conventions. They were about to encounter an enemy that recognized none of those conventions, that cared nothing for individual lives, that would respond to the death of one general by sending 10 more, that would match precision with annihilation. Before we watch everything collapse, let me take you inside Alamut. Let me show you what daily life was like in this legendary fortress, because Alamut wasn't merely a military installation. It was a complete society, a functioning community with its own culture, its own rhythms, its own understanding of what mattered in life. The fortress itself was built on a narrow ridge of rock, perhaps 400 meters long but only 30 to 35 meters wide at its widest point. In this confined space, Nizari architects created something remarkable. There were residential quarters for Hassan and later leaders, their families, their immediate advisors. There were barracks for warriors and guards. There were sections for scholars and missionaries. There were workshops for craftsmen, storage facilities for food and weapons, meeting rooms for planning and teaching. The water system was particularly ingenious. Deep cisterns carved directly into the living rock could hold enough water for thousands of people for years. Rainwater was collected through sophisticated channel systems that directed every drop into storage. During sieges, while attacking armies below struggled with supply lines stretched across hostile territory, the people inside Alamut drank fresh water and never worried about thirst. The food storage was equally impressive. Massive underground facilities held wheat, barley, olive oil, honey, dried fruits, everything necessary for long-term survival. The historian Giovanni, who entered Alamut after its fall, described how someone nearly drowned in a honey reservoir because it was so deep and so full. This wasn't exaggeration. The Nizaris understood that independence meant self-sufficiency, that true freedom required the ability to endure indefinitely without external support. But perhaps Alamut's greatest treasure wasn't military. It was intellectual. Hassan-i Sabbah was a scholar before he was a revolutionary leader, and he understood that knowledge was power as real as any fortress wall. He created a library at Alamut that rivaled any in the Islamic world. He collected manuscripts from everywhere he could reach. The library contained religious texts, certainly, including rare Ismaili theological works. But it also contained Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus. It contained mathematics, Euclid and Ptolemy. It contained astronomical texts, medical texts, Persian poetry, works on logic and rhetoric. Amidst the blood and daggers, there was a sanctuary of silence. Inside the impregnable walls of Alamut sat one of the world's greatest libraries, filled with ancient Greek philosophy, astronomy and secrets of the stars. Even the Mongols' own historian was stunned by the knowledge hidden in this eagle's nest. The library also housed scientific instruments. Giovanni described finding astrolabes, celestial spheres, devices for measuring and mapping the movements of stars. This reveals something crucial about Alamut. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a research center. Nizari scholars studied astronomy, calculated calendars, attempted to understand the mathematical patterns underlying the universe. Daily life in Alamut was governed by strict discipline. Hassan-i Sabbah was famous for his asceticism. He banned alcohol. He banned musical instruments. He required everyone to live simply, devoting their lives to worship and study rather than pleasure and luxury. When his own son was discovered drinking wine, Hassan ordered his execution. When another son was suspected of involvement in a murder, Hassan ordered that son's execution as well. No exceptions. No family favoritism. The law applied equally to everyone, including the leader's own children. But this asceticism didn't mean life was grim. There were theological discussions, deep conversations about the nature of God and human purpose. There were philosophical debates about texts from different traditions. There were lectures on science, on mathematics, on the natural world. Missionaries were trained in rhetoric and argumentation, learning how to persuade, how to debate, how to defend Ismaili doctrine against critics. Warriors were trained not just in combat but in strategy and tactics, learning to think rather than merely follow orders. Education was emphasized for everyone. Literacy was encouraged regardless of social status, which was highly unusual in an era when most people, even many nobles, couldn't read or write. The Nizaris believed that understanding texts, engaging directly with written knowledge, was essential for spiritual development. This educational emphasis created a community with intellectual sophistication far beyond what might be expected from what outsiders dismissed as a cult of killers. Hassan-i Sabbah himself lived in remarkable isolation. According to tradition, he rarely left his private chamber during his 34 years ruling Alamut. He only went up to the fortress rooftop twice in all those years. His personal life was filled with tragedy, executing his own sons, devoting himself entirely to the cause at the expense of normal human connections. But his legacy, a network of fortresses, a trained organization, a functioning covert system, survived long after his death in 1124. While Alamut was the center of Nizari power in Persia, another important branch developed in Syria. From the early 12th century, Hassan sent missionaries to Syria to proselytize and organize. The region was perfect for Nizari expansion. Syria was caught between Crusader states, the Byzantine Empire, and various Islamic kingdoms. It was fragmented, chaotic, full of opportunities for clever players who knew how to exploit competing powers. The Syrian assassins gradually captured several fortresses in the Jabal Bara Mountains, particularly Masyaf Fortress. In 1169, a remarkable figure came to power, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan ruled the Syrian assassins, more flexible in their alliances. They understood that survival in the Levant required adaptability and the willingness to play different factions against each other. Sinan died in 1193, the same year as Saladin. After him, the Syrian assassins continued to exist but gradually weakened. They faced increasing pressure from the Egyptian Mamluks, who would eventually dominate the region after defeating both Mongols and Crusaders. By 1273, Mamluk Sultan Baybars forced the Syrian assassins to acknowledge his overlordship and integrate into the Mamluk system. They lost their independence but survived as a community. But in the mid-13th century, when our main story takes place, both branches, Persian and Syrian, were still functioning. The network of fortresses still stood. The Fedai still carried out their missions. From the outside, it might have seemed that the assassins were as strong as ever. Inside, however, cracks were beginning to show. And far to the east, beyond the horizons of Persian awareness, a storm was gathering that would sweep away everything they had built. After Hassan-i Sabbah's death in 1124, Alamut was ruled by a succession of lords. Kia Bujurgumid from 1124 to 1138. Muhammad ibn Bujurgumid from 1138 to 1162. Hassan II from 1162 to 1166. All maintained the system Hassan had built, the network of fortresses, the organization of Fedai, the careful balance between military defense and political offense. But in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, something began to shift. The ideological foundation of the Nizaris had been established in 1094 when Fatimid Caliph Al-Mustansir died in Egypt after 60 years of rule. He had designated his eldest son Nizar as successor. However, the powerful vizier Al-Afdal placed the younger son Al-Mustali on the throne instead, claiming Al-Mustansir had changed his mind before death. Nizar rebelled, raised an army, but was defeated and killed in 1095. Hassan-i Sabbah and the Ismailis in Persia sided with Nizar. They declared Al-Mustali a usurper and that the true Imam line continued through Nizar. From this point, the Ismaili community split permanently into two branches, Nizari and Mustali. This division had profound significance. The Nizaris in Persia were now completely independent from Cairo. Nizar's son allegedly escaped to Alamut, where the Nizari Imam lineage continued in secrecy. For many decades afterward, the exact identity of the Imams was a closely guarded secret, both to protect them from assassination and to create an atmosphere of mystery that reinforced their authority. In 1164, Hassan II announced something shocking in a grand ceremony at Alamut. He declared that Qiyamah, spiritual resurrection, had arrived and that traditional Sharia law was no longer binding. He ended Ramadan early, held feasts, drank wine in violation of Islamic prohibitions. This declaration has multiple interpretations among scholars. Some suggest Hassan II was declaring himself Imam or even Mahdi, the prophesied savior. Others argue this was complex theology about achieving spiritual enlightenment beyond external laws. Whatever the true meaning, this declaration reinforced Nizari independence from Orthodox Islam and made them even more hated by Sunni authorities. Hassan II ruled briefly. In 1166, he was assassinated by his own brother-in-law. It was tragically ironic. The leader of the assassins killed by assassination tactics turned against him. His son Muhammad II succeeded at age 19 and ruled for 44 years, from 1166 to 1210. Under Muhammad II's leadership, the assassins reached their peak of power. But after Muhammad II, things began deteriorating. His son, Jalal al-Din Hassan III, came to power in 1210 and did something unexpected. Hassan III's mother was Sunni, and he had been raised with strong Sunni influence. Right after taking power, he announced he was abandoning Nizari doctrine, accepting Orthodox Sunni Islam, and pledging allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. He burned Ismaili books at Alamut and publicly cursed his own ancestors. Scholars debate Hassan III's true motives. Some argue this was sincere conversion. Others say it was taqiyya, strategic concealment, a survival tactic. Perhaps Hassan III recognized that confrontational policy had led Nizaris into a dead end, that accommodation with Sunni powers was the only way to survive. Whatever his motive, Hassan III's policy created chaos within the Nizari community. Many felt betrayed. But Hassan III also gained benefits. Military pressure from Baghdad decreased significantly. Hassan III ruled for 11 years and died in 1221, possibly poisoned. His son, Ala ad-Din Muhammad III, was only 9 years old when he took power. Under the influence of Ismaili advisors, Muhammad III reversed his father's policy, returned to Nizari doctrine, and executed Sunni supporters his father had appointed. Muhammad III ruled for 34 years, from 1221 to 1255, longer than any lord except Hassan-i Sabbah himself. He was a serious scholar, writing theological works and attempting to reform the Nizari state. He tried to punish corrupt fortress commanders who had been exploiting their positions. But these reform efforts created internal enemies, powerful men who resented being held accountable. During this time, a new threat was forming far to the east. In 1219 to 1221, Genghis Khan and the Mongol army conquered the vast Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia in just a few years. They destroyed ancient cities like Bokhara, Samarkand, and Merv with unprecedented brutality. Entire populations were massacred. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. But then the Mongols withdrew eastward, and the Middle East breathed a temporary sigh of relief. Muhammad III tried to seek alliances against the Mongol threat. In 1238, he and the Abbasid Caliph jointly sent delegations to Louis IX of France and Edward I of England, proposing an Islamic-Christian alliance against the Mongols. But the proposal was rejected. Europe wasn't interested in a threat from Central Asia that seemed distant and abstract. In 1255, Muhammad III was assassinated, probably by one of the fortress commanders he had tried to punish. His successor was his son Rukn ad-Din Khurshah, only 25 years old. Rukn ad-Din came to power at the worst possible time imaginable. Because at this very moment, Monk Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had decided it was time to finish the work his grandfather had started. Of Talyui came to power in what's called the Talyuid Revolution. Monk Khan was talented and ambitious. He believed that Tingri, the Mongol sky god, had entrusted him with a divine mission to conquer the entire world. For Monk, there was no room for independent states. Every person on earth must either submit to Mongol authority or be destroyed. There was no third option. No negotiation. No compromise. Only submission or annihilation. After taking power, Monk conducted a comprehensive census of the entire empire. The purpose was to know exactly how many people and resources he commanded, to mobilize effectively for war. After obtaining this data, he planned 2 major simultaneous campaigns. One in the east against the Song dynasty in China. Another in the west against the remaining Islamic states. Monk assigned his brother Kublai the task of conquering the east. His other brother Hulagu was given the mission of conquering the west. Monk's orders to Hulagu were crystal clear, recorded by the historian Rashid al-Din. Treat kindly those who submit and utterly destroy those who do not. Specific objectives included: exterminate the assassins, force the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad to submit or destroy him, conquer Syria, and if possible advance to Egypt. The assassins were the first target, and this wasn't accidental. Why were the assassins prioritized? First, they had killed a Mongol general, Chagatai Noyan, in the early 1240s. For the Mongols, killing one of their generals was an unforgivable challenge to their authority. Second, there were rumors that in 1251, the assassins sent a large delegation to Mongolia supposedly bearing gifts but actually concealing dozens of fetae with a mission to kill Monk Khan himself. Mongol security discovered the plot and forced the delegation to return. This made the assassins not just enemies but direct threats to the great Khan's life. William of Rubruck, a Flemish Franciscan friar sent to Mongolia in 1253, wrote about the strict security measures around Monk. He was surprised by the multiple layers of inspection anyone had to pass through to approach the great Khan. William wrote that they feared the assassins so much that even a stranger's shadow made them anxious. Third, Monk received urging from his Sunni Muslim subjects to destroy the assassins. One story tells of a Qadi from Kazvin who came to Monk's court and opened his robe to reveal iron armor underneath. He said he had to wear this even when coming to the great Khan's court because his fear of assassins was so great. These demonstrations convinced Monk that the assassins represented a threat not just to him personally but to the stability of the entire empire. Finally, Monk had strategic reasons. The assassins controlled a network of fortresses along important routes between Persia and Central Asia. If Hulagu wanted to advance to Baghdad and Syria, he couldn't leave these fortresses behind, always threatening his supply lines. In autumn 1253, Hulagu began his journey from Mongolia to Persia. By Monk's order, 2/10 of the entire empire's fighting force was mobilized for this campaign. Scholars estimate Hulagu's force ranged from 120,000 to perhaps 200,000 men. This army took 2 years to move from Mongolia to Persia, gathering supplies, coordinating logistics, preparing for a campaign that would reshape the Middle East forever. In autumn 1255, Hulagu reached Samarkand. The following month he arrived at Kish. He was gathering detailed intelligence about the region's terrain, politics, military situation. He sent spies into Nizari territory. He ordered local vassals to provide troops and supplies. Meanwhile at Alamut, Rukn ad-Din Khurshah was desperately trying to prepare. But he faced multiple problems. Some fortress commanders didn't trust him because he was young and inexperienced. The treasury was depleted. The network of alliances had collapsed. And most critically, he had no real army. The Nizari strategy had never been about fielding armies. It had been about avoiding large-scale military confrontation entirely. Rukn ad-Din attempted diplomacy. He sent envoys to Mongol commanders offering submission and tribute. But the Mongols weren't interested in tribute. They wanted complete extermination. As Juvayni later wrote, Monk Khan had ordered that not a single Nizari should survive. The Mongol military machine approaching the Nizari fortresses was unlike anything the Islamic world had seen before. This wasn't an army in the traditional medieval sense. It was an entire nation mobilized for war. Every Mongol warrior was a cavalry archer trained from childhood. They could shoot accurately while riding at full gallop. They could survive on minimal rations. They moved with speed that seemed impossible to medieval observers, covering distances in days that would take traditional armies weeks. But more importantly, the Mongols brought Chinese siege engineers who had perfected the art of fortress warfare over centuries of campaigns in China. They brought massive trebuchets that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They brought mangonels, battering rams, siege towers. Most terrifyingly, they brought gunpowder weapons, primitive bombs and incendiary devices that created psychological terror as much as physical damage. The Mongols had conquered the fortified cities of China, the strongest fortifications in the world at that time. The mountain castles of Persia, impressive as they were, would not stop them. The Mongols also understood psychological warfare as well as the assassins did. They cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that resisted were utterly destroyed, their populations massacred down to the last person, their buildings burned, their irrigation systems destroyed. Cities that surrendered were spared. This created a powerful incentive structure. As the Mongol army approached, defenders had to ask themselves, is resistance worth the certain death of everyone we love? Often the answer was no. In spring 1256, Hulagu formally entered Nizari territory. The final confrontation was about to begin. And for the assassins who had built their entire strategy around causing fear in their enemies, they were about to experience true terror for the first time. But what if the Mongols weren't the villains of this story? What if the assassins had created such fear, such instability, such unpredictable danger across the Islamic world that their destruction was almost inevitable? What if, in perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare, they had made themselves into a problem that the first truly systematic, truly ruthless empire would feel compelled to solve permanently? Hulagu's campaign began not at Alamut but in Kohistan, a region in eastern Persia where the Nizaris held many fortresses. By attacking Kohistan first, Mongol troops entered and began systematic massacre. Adult males were killed almost entirely. Women and children were enslaved. Buildings were looted and then burned. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in the region for centuries were destroyed. When the Mongols finished, Tun was no longer a city but a pile of ashes and a warning. News of the disaster at Tun spread rapidly through the Nizari network. Some fortresses surrendered immediately. Others prepared for resistance to the end. Rukn ad-Din realized he faced unavoidable catastrophe. In May 1256, Rukn ad-Din sent his brother Shahanshah with a delegation to meet Mongol commander Yasur at Kazvin. They brought gifts and declared the Imam was ready to surrender. Yasur listened but didn't believe the sincerity of the offer. He detained Shahanshah and conducted a probing attack into the Rudbar region. On June 12, a small battle occurred at Mount Dalaman near Alamut. Nizari forces defeated Yasur in a skirmish, one of the few Nizari military victories. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Yasur withdrew but continued harassing the countryside, burning villages, disrupting agriculture. In July, Hulagu sent envoys directly to Rukn ad-Din with a demand: destroy the towers and fortifications of Alamut, Meymundiz and Lamsar. Rukn ad-Din, hoping compliance might save his people, ordered demolition to begin. But here a cultural misunderstanding occurred. Hulagu, as a nomad from the steppes, didn't understand how long it took to demolish massive stone constructions built over decades. When he saw slow progress, he suspected Rukn ad-Din was playing for time, deliberately delaying. On November 8, 1256, Hulagu ran out of patience. He led his main army to Meymundiz fortress. He established a camp on a hill opposite the fortress and ordered a complete siege. Meymundiz, unlike Alamut perched on a nearly inaccessible mountain peak, was built in a position where siege engines could reach it. Although winter was approaching, brutal winter in those mountains, Hulagu decided to continue. The first 3 days, Mongol mangonels conducted preliminary bombardment from nearby hills. Stones weighing 50 to 100 kilograms flew through the air in great arcs, smashing into walls and towers. Casualties occurred on both sides. On the 4th day, the Mongols conducted a frontal assault but were repelled. Nizari defenders fought with the desperation of people who knew there was no escape, no mercy, no possibility of survival except through victory. The Mongols deployed heavier weapons. Large trebuchets were brought forward. Chinese engineers prepared naphtha bombs, ceramic containers filled with flammable liquids that shattered on impact, spreading fire that water couldn't extinguish. The Mongols began shooting large arrows soaked in burning pitch. These arrows flew through the sky like falling stars, arcing over walls and embedding in wooden buildings inside the fortress, causing fires that defenders struggled desperately to control. Hulagu ordered additional mangonels erected around the fortress from all directions. Now Meymundiz was bombarded from all sides simultaneously. The walls began cracking under the relentless impact. Towers collapsed, crushing defenders beneath tons of stone. Rukn ad-Din, seeing that further resistance would only lead to everyone's death, ordered envoys to request negotiations. On November 19, after 11 days of fierce resistance, he decided to surrender. Rukn ad-Din, along with his vizier and some close associates, descended the mountain. When he came before Hulagu, he knelt and declared complete surrender. Strangely, Hulagu didn't kill Rukn ad-Din immediately. He needed Rukn ad-Din alive to order the remaining fortresses to surrender. In the Nizari belief system, absolute loyalty to the Imam was sacred. Hulagu understood this and exploited it ruthlessly. Hulagu forced Rukn ad-Din to write letters to all Nizari fortresses ordering them to surrender. About 40 fortresses received the order and complied. But Alamut and Lamsar initially refused. The commander of Alamut, Muhtasham, suspected the Imam was acting under duress, that these orders were being written with a Mongol sword at his throat. Hulagu didn't want to storm Alamut by force if he could avoid it. The logistics would be difficult, the casualties potentially high. He kept Rukn ad-Din at his side and together they proceeded to Lamsar. Meanwhile, Hulagu left a large force under General Bulagan to besiege Alamut. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Even the wind seemed to be waiting. After just a few days in December 1256, when Muhtasham was clearly informed that the Imam truly wanted the fortress to surrender, that this wasn't coercion but genuine command, he opened the gates. On December 15, 1256, Mongol troops entered Alamut. The legendary fortress that had stood firm for 166 years, that had repelled every Seljuk siege, that represented the physical manifestation of Hassan-i Sabbah's dream, fell without a final battle. Juvayni was among the first to enter. What he saw astonished him. Alamut wasn't just a military fortress. It was a cultural and intellectual center. Juvayni described chambers containing wine, vinegar, honey, and other goods filled so full that someone nearly drowned in a honey reservoir because it was so deep and full. But Alamut's greatest treasure was its library. Juvayni saved copies of the Quran and other valuable books as well as astronomical instruments. But all books relating to what he called their heresy and error were burned. This was an irreparable cultural catastrophe. Centuries of Ismaili theological works, philosophical texts, historical records, scientific observations, all went up in flames. Most of what we know about the assassins comes from their enemy sources because the Nizari's own voices were silenced that day. After looting the library, Mongol troops began systematic destruction of the fortress itself. Juvayni described how the walls, reinforced with lime and lead, were very difficult to destroy. They had to burn the buildings first, then demolish them piece by piece. Eventually, Alamut became a pile of rubble scattered across that narrow mountain ridge. Lamsar fortress fell in January 1257, its defenders weakened by a cholera outbreak. But Khurshah fortress, perched on an even more inaccessible peak, persisted. The Mongols couldn't attack directly. They decided on a long-term siege, building permanent structures around the fortress, settling in to wait. On December 15, 1270, 13 years after Alamut fell, Khurshah's defenders finally surrendered. Not because of lack of food or water, but because they had run out of clothing in the harsh winter cold. The fall of Khurshah marked the absolute end of Nizari military resistance. When it became clear that some fortresses wouldn't surrender despite the Imam's orders, Rukn ad-Din proposed something to Hulagu. He wanted permission to go to Mongolia to meet Great Khan Monk directly. He said if he could meet Monk, perhaps he could negotiate terms, perhaps he could persuade the remaining fortresses to surrender, perhaps he could save at least some of his people. Hulagu agreed. Whether he actually intended to let Rukn ad-Din negotiate or whether this was a calculated cruelty, a false hope offered to extract maximum cooperation, we'll never know with certainty. A small entourage was prepared. Rukn ad-Din, a few family members, some close associates, and a Mongol escort. The journey from Persia to Mongolia was massive, thousands of kilometers across some of the harshest terrain on earth. After many months of arduous travel, they finally reached Karakorum, the Mongol capital. When brought before Monk for an audience, Rukn ad-Din must have hoped his plea would be heard. He must have hoped that surrender, cooperation, the fall of nearly every fortress, the ending of Nizari resistance, would earn at least some mercy. But Monk had no intention of showing mercy. According to sources, Monk rebuked Rukn ad-Din for having obstructed Mongol forces, for having failed to deliver Lamsar and Khurshah as promised. Monk didn't care about explanations that some fortress commanders didn't obey the Imam's orders. Monk ordered Rukn ad-Din to return to Persia. But Monk had also given a secret command. On the return journey at a remote location, possibly near the Alborz Mountains in southern Mongolia or northern China, far from any witnesses who might tell the story, the escort received their signal. They turned and attacked Rukn ad-Din's entourage. No warning. No trial. No formal sentencing. Simply cold execution. Rukn ad-Din, his family and his associates were all killed. Their bodies were left where they fell, unmarked, unmourned except by those few who would eventually learn what happened. Rukn ad-Din Khurshah, the 27th Imam of Nizari Ismailis, died in 1256 or early 1257 at approximately 26 years old. His reign lasted just 1 year, a single year in which the state his ancestors had built for 166 years completely collapsed. He inherited a crisis he didn't create. He made the only choices that seemed available. He surrendered to save lives. And in the end, neither surrender nor cooperation nor obedience saved him or those he loved. But Rukn ad-Din's death was only the beginning of a much larger tragedy. Monk Khan had ordered not just the Imam's death but the massacre of the entire Nizari community. Juvaini and Rashid al-Din recorded that Monk issued a general massacre order against all Nizaris wherever they could be found. Mongol troops and their local allies swept through valleys and towns where Nizaris lived. They killed indiscriminately. Men, women, elderly, children. Contemporary estimates, though possibly exaggerated, suggest about 100,000 people were killed in these systematic purges. Why were the Mongols so brutal? Partly strategic. The Mongols understood that Nizaris weren't an ordinary state. They were a covert network and ideology. As long as Nizaris survived anywhere, there was risk they would reorganize, rebuild, resume their operations. The only way to ensure permanent safety was to eliminate the entire community. But there was also a cultural element. In the Mongol worldview, there was a clear division between those who followed Tingri's will as expressed through the Great Khan and those who opposed it. The Nizaris had even dared attempt to assassinate the Great Khan himself. This was unforgivable sacrilege. The entire group had to be punished to make an example for anyone else who might think of challenging Mongol authority. The massacres were systematic and thorough. Mongol commanders received orders to search every village in regions where Nizaris were known to live. Local Sunni populations who had suffered under the threat of Nizari daggers for generations often eagerly assisted in identifying Nizaris. Some who had hidden their Ismaili identity for years were betrayed by neighbors who had always known, always suspected, always waited for the moment when revelation would be safe. Entire families were dragged from their homes and executed in public squares. The Mongols employed a method they had perfected in China: collective responsibility. If a village was found to have sheltered Nizaris, the entire village could be destroyed. This created powerful incentives for communities to turn over any Nizaris among them or risk total annihilation. The psychological warfare was as effective as physical violence. But despite this systematic campaign of extermination, the Mongols couldn't kill everyone. Some Nizaris managed to escape to remote regions beyond effective Mongol control. Some successfully hid their identity, becoming anonymous Muslims, abandoning any outward expression of Ismaili belief. Some fled to areas where Mongol reach was limited: Afghanistan, the Pamir Mountains, Sindh and Pakistan. And these survivors, scattered and traumatized, would eventually become the seeds of the community's remarkable resurrection. Because this is what happens when innovation stops. But the world keeps evolving. The assassins perfected asymmetric warfare centuries before the term existed, but they forgot to evolve when the nature of warfare itself changed. The most shocking part? The order didn't die. It transformed. Immediately after the catastrophe, surviving Nizaris had to make difficult choices. Some fled to remote regions where Mongol reach was difficult: Afghanistan, Badakhshan in the Pamir Mountains, Sindh and what is now Pakistan. Others took refuge in Dalam itself, the original homeland of the movement, where deep valleys and high mountains created countless hiding places. To avoid continued persecution, many Nizaris concealed their religious identity. They blended into Sufi communities, mystical traditions of Islam that were less controversial. Sufism, with its emphasis on personal spiritual experience and symbolic interpretation of religion, had some commonalities with Ismaili theology. Becoming Sufi wasn't completely alien to Nizaris. Some scholars even suggest certain later Sufi orders may have been influenced by Nizari ideas and organizational methods. Throughout the period from roughly 1260 to 1450, what Ismaili scholars call the period of concealment, the imam didn't appear publicly. The imams lived anonymously, often in small villages in Persia, avoiding attention to prevent persecution. They didn't claim their position, didn't govern from fortresses, but lived like ordinary villagers. Nevertheless, a secret organizational system was maintained. The dais, missionaries and organizers, continued operating in secrecy. They traveled from community. His descendants apparently stayed there until the late 15th century. But these were only the last sparks of the fortress era. The world had changed. Nizaris couldn't and didn't want to return to the old strategy. They gradually transformed into a peaceful religious community, focusing not on political power or military resistance but on faith, scholarship and community service. In the 15th century, Nizari imams began reappearing publicly in Anjudan, a small village near Isfahan in Persia. This marked the beginning of the Anjudan revival period. The imams gradually rebuilt prestige and organization, though they never regained political or military power. They became purely religious and spiritual leaders, focusing on maintaining faith and serving the community rather than challenging states or empires. From the 16th century onward, many Nizaris migrated to South Asia, to what is now Pakistan and India. Following trade routes, they established prosperous merchant communities, especially in Gujarat, Mumbai, and Sindh. They became known as honest, hard-working traders, as people who kept their word, who honored contracts, who could be trusted in business dealings. In 1817 or 1814, according to some sources, an important event occurred. The Nizari imam at that time, Hassan-i Sabbah, was granted the title Aga Khan by Fath Ali Shah, the ruler of Persia. This was a title of Turco-Mongol origin meaning lord or chief. The irony here is striking. The very people who nearly exterminated the Nizaris, the Mongols, now inadvertently provided through long-term cultural influence the title their leader would carry into modernity. The first Aga Khan had to leave Persia in the mid-19th century after a conflict with authorities. He migrated to India where he was welcomed by the British Empire. Under British protection, the Nizari community in South Asia flourished. Subsequent Aga Khans, especially Aga Khan III, Sultan Muhammad Shah, who ruled from 1885 to 1957, modernized the community extensively. They established schools, hospitals, charitable organizations. They emphasized education, particularly education for girls, which was revolutionary in traditional South Asian society. They promoted economic development, helping community members establish businesses and improve their circumstances. Aga Khan IV, Prince Shah Karim al-Husseini, came to power in 1957 at age 20, succeeding his grandfather. Under his leadership for over 6 decades now, the Nizari community has become one of the most progressive and well-organized religious communities in the world. The Aga Khan Development Network operates hundreds of projects worldwide. Schools educating over 2 million students annually. Hospitals serving millions of patients. Microfinance banks helping small businesses. Rural development projects improving agriculture and infrastructure. Cultural preservation efforts maintaining historical sites and traditions. Today, the Nizari Ismaili community numbers approximately 15 to 20 million people worldwide. They're concentrated mainly in South Asia, including Pakistan with about 2 million and India especially in Gujarat and Mumbai. Central Asia including Tajikistan and Afghanistan particularly in Badakhshan. The Middle East including Iran and Syria. East Africa including Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda. And the West including Britain, Canada, and the United States with large diaspora communities. Most remarkably, the modern Nizari community completely rejects the violent legacy of the assassins. They don't want to be associated with killers. When asked about assassin history, many modern Nizaris feel uncomfortable. They emphasize that era has passed, that historical context was different, that violence is not part of their faith today. They also affirm an important point. Their Fedai never needed drugs for courage. They're offended by the hashish myth that gave the assassins their Western name. For them, their ancestors were people of sincere faith willing to sacrifice for what they believed, not drug-addicted brainwashed individuals. This is perhaps one of the most astonishing resurrection stories in history. A community nearly completely erased didn't just survive but flourished into an influential and respected global community. They did this not through weapons, not through violence, not by clinging to the past, but by adapting, evolving and focusing on education, commerce and community service. The transformation from a feared network of assassins to a respected community of educators, healthcare providers and development workers is nothing short of miraculous. It demonstrates that identity isn't fixed, that communities can fundamentally transform themselves, and that the power of peaceful development ultimately exceeds the power of violence. Now, after traveling through this entire story from Hassan-i Sabbah's rise to the collapse under Mongol forces and finally the miraculous resurrection, we need to pause and reflect. What can we learn from this history that echoes across centuries into our own time? First lesson: no strategy is invincible forever. For over 150 years, the assassins proved that a small force with smart tactics could confront empires far more powerful. They perfected the art of asymmetric warfare centuries before the term was invented. They showed that one dagger in the right hand at the right time could have greater impact than an army of 10,000. But they made the critical mistake of believing their strategy would work forever. They didn't realize the world was changing around them. When the Mongols appeared with advanced siege technology, with army scales they couldn't match, with willingness to use violence at levels the assassins had never imagined, the old tactics no longer worked. This is a lesson for every organization, every nation, every individual in any era. What makes you successful today could cause your failure tomorrow if you don't continue adapting and evolving. The world doesn't stand still waiting for you to catch up. Second lesson: fear is a powerful tool but also a double-edged sword. The assassins built their entire empire on fear. They made sultans tremble. They made generals wear armor even while sleeping. They created an atmosphere where no one felt safe. And this gave them influence far exceeding their actual numbers and resources. But fear also creates hatred. People feared the assassins but they also hated them. When an enemy appeared who wasn't subdued by fear, who couldn't be deterred by psychological warfare, no one stood up to defend the assassins. Many Islamic communities actually rejoiced at seeing them destroyed. This lesson remains relevant today. Power based on fear may be effective in the short term, but it's not sustainable long term. True power, lasting power, comes from respect, from trust, from positive relationships rather than from making others afraid. Third lesson: a man with his strategic vision, his experience, his prestige might have handled the situation differently. Perhaps he would have recognized sooner that fighting the Mongols with old methods was impossible. Perhaps he would have evacuated the most important people, hidden valuable documents, created secret bases for later reconstruction. But instead, power fell to Rukn ad-Din Khurshah, a young, inexperienced person coming to power at the worst possible time. He wasn't a bad leader, but he wasn't the leader that moment needed. And the difference between capable leadership and insufficient leadership can be the difference between survival and extinction. Fifth lesson: adapt or die. This is perhaps the most important lesson. The assassins succeeded initially because they adapted to the 11th and 12th century world, a world of fragmented kingdoms, personal power, and small-scale warfare. Assassination tactics were perfect for that world. But when the world changed, when centralized empires emerged, when military technology advanced, when the scale of warfare increased dramatically, the assassins didn't adapt fast enough. They clung to old tactics, and that inflexibility destroyed them. However, the Nizari community after the catastrophe showed astonishing adaptability. They completely abandoned military and political strategy. They shifted to commerce, education, social welfare. They adapted to each new era: Safavid period, British colonial period, modern era, and each time found ways not just to survive but to thrive. Sixth lesson: culture and community are stronger than military power. The Mongols destroyed every Nizari fortress. They killed tens of thousands. They burned libraries, attempting to erase history itself. Physically, they annihilated the Nizari state. But they couldn't destroy faith, culture, community consciousness. These existed in the hearts and minds of survivors, and as long as these existed, the community could be rebuilt. Today, no Alamut fortresses remain standing. No assassin networks remain active. But the Nizari Ismaili community still exists, 15 to 20 million strong, spread across the world. What survived wasn't military power but cultural identity, religious faith, community consciousness. So did the assassins dig their own grave, or was this an unavoidable fate? The answer, like most historical questions, isn't simple. Yes, they created enemies with their tactics. Yes, they didn't adapt fast enough to the changing world. Yes, they made strategic mistakes. But it's also true that the Mongols were a force few in that era's world could resist. The Khwarezmian Empire, far more powerful than the assassins, was crushed. The Caliph of Baghdad, nominal leader of the entire Sunni Islamic world, was killed. Crusader kingdoms were driven from the Holy Land. Therefore, one could argue the assassins did their best in extremely difficult circumstances. Rukn ad-Din by surrendering saved at least some Nizaris from complete massacre. If he had chosen resistance to the end at every fortress, perhaps no one would have survived to tell the story, to maintain the faith, to rebuild eventually. Survival sometimes requires humility, accepting defeat, letting go of ego, enduring humiliation to preserve the core of what matters. Rukn ad-Din didn't die as a hero on a battlefield. He died on a remote road, betrayed, forgotten by all except those who loved him. But because he surrendered, some Nizaris survived. And from those survivors, a new community emerged. This isn't the kind of glamorous heroism we often see in stories. But this is the kind of heroism real history actually needs. People willing to make difficult decisions, to endure pain and humiliation so others can live. Today, if you travel to Iran and dare to climb the treacherous mountains of the Alborz range, you can still find the ruins of Alamut. Not much remains. Just collapsed walls, old foundations, stones bearing the marks of history and violence and time. But if you stand there and look out over the valley below, you can imagine Hassan-i Sabbah's feeling when he first saw this place, knowing this would be where he'd build his dream. You can also imagine Rukn ad-Din's despair when he saw Mongol forces advancing, knowing his world was about to end. But if you understand the full story, you'll also know that wasn't truly the end. Because somewhere in this world, in Pakistan, India, Tanzania, Canada, Britain, America, and perhaps even where you're listening to this right now, millions of Nizari Ismailis are living, working, raising children, continuing their ancestors' traditions. Not the tradition of daggers and fortresses, but the tradition of faith, community, perseverance. Not the tradition of fear, but the tradition of education and service. Not the tradition of violence, but the tradition of building rather than destroying. And that's the final message of this story. In history's long flow, it's not military power or political strategy that ultimately determines who survives. It's the ability to adapt. It's the strength of community. It's the will to never give up even when everything seems lost. Alamut may have fallen. The fortresses may be ruins. The Feda may be gone. But the idea they represented, the idea that a small community can stand firm against adversity, the idea that faith and unity can overcome seemingly impossible challenges, that idea lives on. That's the true legacy. Not the fear they spread but the remarkable resilience their descendants demonstrated. It's a lesson for all of us in whatever challenges we face, whatever obstacles seem insurmountable. No matter how hard life knocks us down, as long as we maintain faith, community, and hope, we can rise and rebuild. The night is quiet now. The winds have settled. The story is told. And somewhere high in those Persian mountains, the stones of Alamut still stand as monuments to human ambition, human failure, and ultimately human resilience. Sleep well, knowing that even from the greatest falls, even from the most complete defeats, rebirth is possible. The eagle's nest may be empty, but the eagles still fly.